Welcome back and thank you for keeping it NTV. You are still watching NTV Weekend Edition. Now for the last 2 weeks, but especially this weekend, the matter of excessive tuition costs is high on the minds of parents, partly because of how the Education Minister, Janet Museveni, urged school leaders to be kinder to parents, but also because of the school's refusal to comply. So tonight, we ask the question, why do tuition fees continue to climb each year, even with the efforts from the ministry to try to stop this? Now, to help us appreciate this, we do have Elizabeth Atori, a legal officer at the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. Good evening, Elizabeth, and thank you for joining us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me and for enabling us to have this discussion that is very timely.
All right. Well, straight into it. First things first, why do you think the tuition fees continue to rise despite the efforts by the Education Ministry to actually stop this?
Well, I think first we need to ask ourselves what efforts has the ministry been able to undertake in order to enforce school fees regulation. And currently what the Education Ministry has been using, at least in the near past, were circulars. They issue out circulars that then call upon schools not to increase or hike fees. And also, under the Education Act, we have a particular provision of the Act that then requires specifically government-aided schools to make sure that there is consent by the ministry before they increase those fees. However, despite...
That does not apply for the private schools?
Not yet. So that's why there is a conversation around having a statutory instrument that then covers government-aided schools, private schools, public schools, to ensure that they are all brought within the envelope of regulation. We've had our current act since 2008, and since 2008 we haven't had a statutory instrument that then requires that the ministry regulates fees. This is despite the Act specifically under Section 57 requiring that the minister issue statutory instruments. That's why, as an organization, I do work with the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, as where I'm a legal officer. That's why we filed a case before the High Court, asking court to order the minister to be able to issue out a statutory instrument, knowing very well that the reason why we lack a kind of consistency in school fees regulation is because we don't have a mechanism of enforcement. So that the ministry doesn't have a push to ensure that the schools that are required to regulate their fees, then regulate their fees. What the statutory instrument would do is that it would ensure that the ministry has more of a stick to beat the schools that are not enforcing the regulations. So that's why we need to, as a country, move towards regulation, so that then we actually are able to enforce the law that is already in place, both under the Education Act and also the Constitution, to ensure that all learners access school.
Now, as the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, like you've just said, you filed a case against, the government and the Ministry of Education in particular for not having or putting in place the statutory instrument. Why do you think the government is, or the ministry is still reluctant to actually put this to work?
Well, I wouldn't use reluctant. I believe the ministry has taken steps towards putting in place a statutory instrument. Very recently, we saw media coverage around what that statutory instrument would look like, some of the things that they would be regulating, including some of the requirements that are charged by schools outside of tuition fees. So sometimes schools ask for building fees, for PTA, bag of cement,
bricks, slashers,
yeah,
even bricks.
and some of these actually are supposed to be bought within the school premises at prices that are then set by those very schools, instead of using the market prices. So we've seen parents actually come out in protest, requiring that then schools revert some of these policies. Very recently we saw a social media post where parents were requiring that some of these charges, like paying for visitation cards, should be removed. And that there is where the problem lies. Now, what parents have currently is, if a school increases their fees, they have no recourse mechanisms. Right? So what they then revert to is the court of public opinion. They send out social media posts calling upon the schools to be able to call them in, to consult them, so that then they participate. But these are things that could be cured by a statutory instrument to ensure that if this particular school arbitrarily then increases school fees, what is the recourse for those particular parents?
But these are schools that are run entirely independently, and the activities are, or how they run their activities in school entirely depend on the school fees that they actually charge. So don't you think this is going to take a toll on private schools in the long run if the school fees is actually regulated? They have to pay for utilities, they have to pay teachers, and of course do every other activity still using the school fees.
I would like us to go back to, there was a time in this country where we had the slogan, Bonaba Some. That's really is the bedrock of education. Under our Vision 2040 as a country, we have decided that all learners should be able to have an opportunity to go to school. Under the SDGs, one of the goals is to ensure inclusive, quality, equitable education for all children in this country. Education is a public good. It's not a commodity. Despite the involvement of private actors in education, the government still has a mandate to ensure education for all children, whether they are in what we would call public schools or our UPE schools, or whether they are in private schools. Once the government actually then allows private actors to get involved in education, it has a mandate to ensure that it regulates school fees. And that's why the framers of the Education Act knew that this particular mandate had to be exercised, and included that provision under the Education Act, Section 57, calling upon the minister to exercise her mandate. And that mandate has been long overdue. We've had the discussions around increase of school fees even before COVID. Yes, the discussion thickened with post-COVID reopening of schools, because parents had taken about 2 years without having to pay for fees, and then schools opened with astronomical fees, and they were shocked. Yes, but that doesn't mean that the discussion started there. In 2017, we filed a petition to Parliament calling for regulation of fees. That means even before we had the disruption in education, we had a real challenge with school fees. UBOS, under the household survey, has stated that averagely 65% of children that drop out due to the cost of fees. That shows the astronomical problem that we are facing as a country, that the cost of fees is actually now deterring children from accessing education. And this cost doesn't only include private actors or private schools, but we've seen government schools actually put in place particular fees that students have to pay, simply because, of course, there are real challenges around the amount of resources that is being channeled towards education, and that, of course, needs to increase. We've had the discussion around the need to increase the capitation grants and for government to invest more to ensure more quality and better quality for education. But that doesn't take away the mandate of government to regulate. And if the government is able to regulate, we as citizens need to ensure that the government regulates education for inclusive education for all our children.
Well, yes, so recently the Ministry of Education set up a draft statutory instrument setting up limits for tuition fees, such as 1.6 million for those that are in boarding school and boarding secondary schools in particular. So what happens to those that are already charging less, or those that are actually above this amount?
Yeah, and it's a good thing that statutory instrument is due for Cabinet to approve. Those are some of the questions that I believe Cabinet should ask the ministry. How are we able to effectively regulate? What countries have been able to regulate fees? How have they done it? Rwanda, I'll give an example of Rwanda. For its regulation instrument, it regulates government-aided and public schools, but also requires that for private schools, that then they ensure involvement of the parents associations in order to then agree on some of the fees that can be paid. This would enable participation, and participation is key in such issues such as school fees setting. What we see currently is that school administrations arbitrarily on their own accord come up and set a particular cap of fees that parents are forced to pay, and if you aren't able to pay, then relocate to another school. But in a country where we see insufficient investment in public education, we then need to ensure that for private actors that then are coming up to offer that service, that then these are regulated to ensure that the students that are able to pay, but also to ensure that we have a system in place that is making schools accountable, that is ensuring participation of parents, and that is able to enable us meet our targets, particularly our Vision 2040 as a country.
Well, do you think that there are other issues at play, say economic forces, that the Ministry of Education considers more critical than just, coming up or enforcing the form of regulation of fees?
Well, I believe with the Ministry of Education in the past coming out and actually particularly being clear about increase in fees, I believe where their challenge is not about the play of economic forces. Where their challenge is about enforceability. How do they ensure that the fees that are set or the regulations that are set in place are actually being enforced? And that's what a statutory instrument is supposed to cure.
Okay, so as we wrap this up, how do you think this should be handled in your parting shot?
My parting shots would be this. As a government, it's about time that we regulate fees. We need to ensure that we maintain the momentum that we have set. Our Ministry of Education needs to actually proceed and pass the statutory instruments. Yes, we've gone into another term, but we have second term coming in. We need to make sure that we use this time that we have to be able to ensure that we put in place regulations that allow all children to go to school.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth Atori, a legal officer at the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights. And thank you all for joining us. We now take a break and continue with NTV Weekend Edition.